Ms. Johnson, it's painfully obvious you've bitten off more than you can chew. Mathematics at this level is clearly out of your league. Professor Whitmore's voice sliced through the quiet lecture hall, his words sharpened by a tone of disdain that was unmistakable. He was tall, with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone he deemed unworthy. And to him, Jasmine Johnson, a young black woman sitting at the front of his advanced calculus class, was the very definition of unworthy. The other students exchanged uneasy glances, some snickering, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Jasmine felt her cheeks burn, her fists clenching beneath the table. She had answered the professor's complex problem with confidence, her work meticulous and clear. But the professor hadn't even bothered to check her solution. He had dismissed her with a casual cruelty, his smirk daring her to protest. Jasmine's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. With all due respect, Professor Whitmore, I believe my answer is correct. Perhaps you should take a look at my calculations. The room fell into a hush. No one spoke to Professor Whitmore like that. Not even the smartest students dared challenge him. Whitmore's thin lips curled into a mocking smile. Oh, I see. The young lady thinks she's a genius. Very well, Ms. Johnson. Since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and solve the problem on the board for everyone to see? His words dripped with sarcasm, and Jasmine could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her. But she didn't falter. Rising from her seat, she walked to the board, her spine straight, her expression calm. Picking up the chalk, she faced the board and began to write. Her hand moved with swift precision, each line of calculation flawless, each theorem applied with brilliance. Her mind danced with numbers and patterns, her passion for mathematics pouring from her fingers as she worked. By the time she finished, the board was filled with complex formulas, the solution shining like a masterpiece crafted with pure intellect. Jasmine stepped back, her breath steady, her eyes locked on the professor's stunned face. For a moment, Whitmore seemed to be at a loss for words. His gaze shifted from the board to Jasmine, and then back to the board again. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. But then, with a cold smile that sent chills down Jasmine's spine, Whitmore spoke. Impressive performance, Ms. Johnson. But anyone can memorize formulas and regurgitate them on a board. Understanding, however, is a different matter entirely. Clearly, you lack the depth required to grasp real mathematics. The words struck Jasmine like a slap to the face. The humiliation was palpable, raw, and searing. She had given her all, displayed her talent for everyone to see, only for the professor to tear her down with vicious cruelty. And as the other students whispered and laughed, their faces blending into a blur of mockery and indifference, Jasmine made a vow. She would show them all. She would prove to Professor Whitmore that his prejudice couldn't break her. Her journey had only just begun. The days that followed were nothing short of torment for Jasmine. Professor Whitmore seemed to have made it his personal mission to humiliate her at every turn. In his eyes, she was nothing more than an intruder, a black girl daring to challenge his precious, predominantly white classroom. Ms. Johnson, do you need me to slow down for you? I wouldn't want the material to be too difficult for you to comprehend, he sneered during a lecture, his tone laced with icy condescension. The jab was met with a ripple of chuckles from her classmates, their laughter cutting into her skin like glass. She clenched her teeth and stared straight ahead, refusing to let him see the anger boiling beneath her calm exterior. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel small and insignificant, as if her very presence was an offense. "Ms. Johnson, could you perhaps enlighten us with the answer to this problem?" he would ask, his smirk already forming before the words left his mouth. Every time Jasmine raised her hand, he either pretended not to see her or ridiculed her answers without even glancing at her work. She became the unwilling centerpiece of his scorn, a target he took pleasure in belittling. But Jasmine wasn't just smart. She was resilient. Raised by a single mother who'd taught her that her skin was beautiful and her mind was powerful, Jasmine held on to those words with a fierce grip. She refused to be broken by a bitter man clinging to outdated beliefs. Still, the battle was exhausting. The classmates who might have been allies kept their distance, too afraid of drawing Whitmore's ire. Instead, they whispered behind her back, their voices tainted with envy and disdain. "I heard she only got into this program because of some diversity quota. She's just trying to prove she's better than everyone else. Typical. Bet she's not even that smart, just acting like she knows stuff to get attention." The cruelty was relentless, but Jasmine poured her frustration into her studies. Every insult became fuel, every slight a reason to sharpen her skills. She spent late nights bent over her textbooks, solving equations with a ferocity that left her fingers aching. But no matter how much she excelled, Professor Whitmore refused to acknowledge her worth. Every test was returned with the same dismissive scrawl of "could do better" scribbled across the top. Even when she scored higher than most of her peers, he would find a way to undermine her achievements. One afternoon, as she handed in a particularly complex assignment, Whitmore glanced at her paper with a crooked smile. "Ah, Ms. Johnson. Turning in your work on time for once. Miraculous." "I always submit my work on time, Professor," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Is that so?" Whitmore said, pretending to inspect her paper before tossing it carelessly onto his desk. "Well, I suppose we can't expect too much. It's only natural for some students to struggle." He emphasized the word "some" with a sneer, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Jasmine felt her chest tighten, but she kept her gaze level, refusing to let his hatred consume her. Then came the day when Whitmore's cruelty reached its peak. He had announced a special challenge in class, a problem so complex it was meant to test the limits of their understanding. He called it the impossible equation, a puzzle so difficult that only the brightest minds could hope to solve it. "Since Ms. Johnson is so eager to prove herself, why don't we have her attempt the challenge first?" Whitmore's smile was a twisted thing, a sickening blend of arrogance and spite. He beckoned her to the board with a mocking wave of his hand. The students' eyes followed her with a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation. They all expected her to fail. Jasmine hesitated for only a moment before standing up. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribcage, her nerves crackling with both fear and determination. As she approached the board, she caught snippets of the hateful murmurs from the back of the class. "She's done for. No way she can solve that. Just wants to prove she's better than us. She deserves to be knocked down a peg." But Jasmine blocked out their voices. All she could hear was her mother's words echoing in her mind. "You are powerful. Your mind is your weapon. Never let anyone tell you what you can or cannot be." She picked up the chalk and faced the monstrous equation scrawled across the board. It was a nightmare of symbols and numbers woven into a riddle meant to humiliate her. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the problem, her mind firing on all cylinders as she dissected each part with precision. She scribbled calculations with a furious intensity, breaking down the components until the impossible became possible. By the time she stepped back from the board, her fingers were trembling. The entire class was silent, eyes wide and mouths agape as they stared at the completed solution that stretched across the board like a masterpiece. Whitmore's expression was unreadable, his face pale and his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. But Jasmine saw the shock flickering in his eyes, the realization that she had done the impossible right before his very eyes. And just when Jasmine thought he would finally acknowledge her brilliance, Professor Whitmore's gaze darkened. "Well, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice colder than ice, "you may have gotten lucky this time, but you still have much to learn. Don't think you've proven anything here." The cruelty of his words was like a slap to the face, but Jasmine refused to let them crush her. She had done the impossible, and no amount of Whitmore's hatred could take that away from her. But deep down, Jasmine knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The silence in the classroom was thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. All eyes were fixed on the board, where Jasmine's flawless solution glittered like defiance, written in chalk. The very challenge that Professor Whitmore had designed to humiliate her now stood as undeniable proof of her brilliance. Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he stared at the board, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out like twisted ropes. His carefully constructed facade of superiority was crumbling before him, and he hated her for it. Hated her for daring to be smart. Hated her for making him look like a fool in front of the entire class. But his voice came out smooth and cold, his smile dripping with venom. "Well, well, Miss Johnson, it appears you've managed to mimic the correct answer. Quite a feat for someone of your background." The sneer in his words was unmistakable, and Jasmine's fists tightened at her sides. He couldn't even bring himself to acknowledge her intelligence without dragging her down, reminding her that in his eyes she didn't belong. The laughter from some of the students stung like thorns. They took their cues from Whitmore, their snickers echoing the prejudice he spewed so casually. It wasn't just about her being a woman in a predominantly male class. It was about her being black, about her daring to excel in a space they believed wasn't meant for her. "That's a good one, Professor," chuckled Brent, one of the wealthier students who seemed to bask in Whitmore's approval like a pet dog craving scraps. "Maybe next time she'll manage to solve something without just copying formulas off Google." Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she kept her chin high. She knew they would say anything to undermine her success. It didn't matter that her work was original, that her passion for mathematics was genuine. To them, she was nothing but an outsider clawing her way into a world they'd tried to keep closed. Whitmore's eyes glinted with satisfaction at Brent's comment. "Indeed, Brent. Perhaps Ms. Johnson could benefit from spending more time studying and less time pretending to understand subjects far beyond her capabilities." The cruelty of his words made Jasmine's skin crawl. It was clear now that Whitmore's hatred wasn't just casual racism, it was something deeper, something twisted and malicious. But Jasmine had no intention of letting him break her. Not now, not ever. "I didn't pretend to understand anything, Professor," Jasmine said, her voice steady and controlled. "I worked through the problem using advanced theorems and logical reasoning. If you want, I can walk you through each step to show how I arrived at the solution." Her words were like a challenge, and the tension in the room sharpened. The other students watched, with eager anticipation, some waiting for Whitmore to tear her apart, others intrigued by her unwavering courage. Whitmore's gaze bore into her, his expression darkening with every passing second. "Don't patronize me, Ms. Johnson. You may have fooled the rest of the class, but I see right through your little act. If you think a few memorized formulas make you a mathematician, then you are sorely mistaken." He spoke with such icy contempt that Jasmine could almost feel the chill in his words, and yet she refused to shrink before him. "Mathematics isn't about memorization, Professor. It's about understanding. And I understand this subject more than you're willing to admit." The statement hung in the air like a defiant banner, her confidence unshaken despite his attempts to tear her down. But Whitmore wasn't done. If anything, her composure only seemed to enrage him further. "I've been teaching mathematics longer than you've been alive, Miss Johnson, and believe me, I can recognize when someone is out of their depth." His voice lowered to a hiss, meant only for her. "People like you always try to force your way into places you don't belong. You think you can just waltz in here and prove you're better than everyone else? It's pathetic." Jasmine's heart pounded, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and pain. His words were meant to wound, to remind her that in his eyes, her worth would always be diminished by her skin. But she refused to let his hatred seep into her soul. Instead, she allowed his words to fuel her determination. If he wanted to push her down, she would rise higher. Whitmore's lip curled as he spoke louder, making sure the whole class could hear. "Since you're so determined to play the genius, Ms. Johnson, I expect nothing less than perfection from you. From now on, you will solve all complex problems I present to the class. And if you fail even once, I will make sure everyone here understands just how much of a fraud you truly are." Jasmine could feel the weight of his challenge pressing down on her, a deliberate attempt to break her spirit. But instead of cowering, she nodded firmly. "Challenge accepted, Professor. I'll show you what real understanding looks like." The words were powerful, spoken with a calm that hid the raging fire within her. The students whispered among themselves, some fascinated, others cruelly amused. But Jasmine wasn't doing this for them. This was for herself, for every time she'd been made to feel small, for every opportunity snatched away by prejudice. She was tired of letting people like Professor Whitmore define her limits. And if he wanted a battle, then she would give him one he would never forget. From that day on, Professor Whitmore waged an all-out war against Jasmine. Every lecture was a new battlefield where he tried to crush her confidence with increasingly difficult equations, relentless scrutiny, and constant belittling. "Ms. Johnson, since you're so confident in your so-called understanding, why don't you show us how to solve this?" Whitmore would say, scribbling monstrously complex problems on the board that even the brightest students in the class would struggle with. Jasmine's hands would tremble as she took the chalk, but her eyes never wavered. Each problem was a puzzle, a challenge she met with determination sharper than steel. She quickly became the class's reluctant spectacle. Her classmates watched her with a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and pity. The white students who once ignored her now found entertainment in her daily battles with Whitmore, their smirks and murmurs drilling into her soul. "Look at her, always trying to act like she's better than everyone else," sneered Ashley, a blonde girl who flaunted her family's wealth with designer clothes and diamond-studded watches. "Probably just wants the attention." "Yeah, her kind always thinks they deserve a free pass," added Brent, his voice thick with contempt. "Bet you she's only here because of affirmative action. They let anyone in these days." Their words stung, but Jasmine forced herself to block them out. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a gentle reminder of her own power. "You belong everywhere your mind dares to take you, and no one can take that away." But the harassment wasn't confined to the classroom. It seeped into her daily life, twisting her existence into a cruel, never-ending nightmare. Her dorm room was trashed one night, her notebooks scattered and torn, pages filled with hateful messages scribbled in red ink. Go back to where you came from. No place for your kind here. Just drop out already. The vandalism was reported, but the university's response was weak. Nothing more than a shallow apology from the administration and a suggestion to ignore the childish pranks. Jasmine could see the dismissal in their eyes, the unwillingness to confront the racism plaguing their prestigious institution. Yet, she continued to show up to class every day, her chin held high, her expression locked in defiance. Whitmore's hatred grew with each success she achieved, his voice thick with venom whenever she solved the impossible problems he threw at her. But even worse than his words was the way he manipulated her grades. Assignments she knew she had aced were returned with D's and C's, his comments scrawled in the margins like poison. Unoriginal work. Lacks comprehension. Barely acceptable. Jasmine tried to appeal to the administration, but Whitmore's reputation shielded him like a fortress. The university's response was predictable and infuriating. Professor Whitmore is one of our most respected lecturers, the dean had said with a rehearsed smile. I'm sure you're just misinterpreting his strict teaching style. He pushes students to be their best. That's all. Jasmine left the office with her fists clenched, the bitterness of betrayal thick in her throat. Whitmore's power seemed untouchable, his influence spreading like a disease that infected everyone around him. She found herself withdrawing from the few friends she had made, too exhausted to explain the daily torment she endured. Her late nights grew even later as she poured herself into her studies, her obsession with proving herself becoming a desperate drive. But even as she grew weary, she refused to surrender. Whitmore wanted her to break. He wanted her to crawl away in shame, to confirm his twisted belief that she was inferior. And that was something Jasmine would never give him. Then came the midterm exam, an exam Whitmore had designed to be a nightmare of complexity. 3 hours of merciless calculations, theory, and logic so intricate that even his brightest students emerged from the hall pale and trembling. Jasmine was the last to leave. As she handed her paper to Whitmore, his gaze flicked over her with that same infuriating smirk. Well, Ms. Johnson, I'm sure you gave it your best. I can only hope it was enough. More than enough, Jasmine replied with a calmness that surprised even herself. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, the challenge in her voice cutting through his false politeness. We'll see, won't we? Days passed before the results were posted. When Jasmine approached the bulletin board, her heart thudding painfully in her chest, she found her name listed at the very top, the highest score in the entire class. She should have felt elation, but instead, all she felt was dread, because she knew Whitmore would not take this lightly. She had embarrassed him yet again, shattered the image he had tried to paint of her as a fraud, and that meant his retaliation would be even more vicious. She was right. The next time Jasmine entered the classroom, Whitmore's expression was colder than ever. He didn't acknowledge her presence, but the way his eyes glinted with something dark and dangerous made her stomach twist with unease. He waited until the end of the lecture before announcing, "Class, I have a special announcement. It seems our very own Ms. Johnson believes herself to be a prodigy," Professor Whitmore announced, his voice thick with condescension. His gaze pierced through Jasmine like daggers, an icy smile twisting his lips. So much so that she has earned the highest score on our midterm exam. An impressive feat, no doubt. The class murmured, their voices a tangled web of disbelief, jealousy, and subtle mockery. Jasmine kept her face expressionless, refusing to let Whitmore see her discomfort. But the air was thick with tension, and she could feel their eyes crawling over her like insects. Whitmore's smirk widened, his pleasure evident in the cruelty of his next words. However, I must admit, I find it rather peculiar that Ms. Johnson, someone whose previous work has been, shall we say, questionable, managed to achieve such a result. An anomaly worth investigating. Wouldn't you all agree? The murmurs grew louder, whispers of cheater and lucky guess slithering around the room. Jasmine's hands clenched into fists under her desk. Therefore, I've decided to offer Ms. Johnson the opportunity to prove herself, Whitmore continued, his gaze never leaving her. Right here, right now, a special test of my own design, one that will leave no doubt about her true capabilities. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. This was no test. It was a public execution, a chance for Whitmore to humiliate her in front of everyone and tarnish her reputation beyond repair. Why are you doing this? Jasmine's voice was steady, but her insides were churning. Oh, Ms. Johnson, it's not what I'm doing. It's what you have already done, Whitmore said with mock concern. Surely someone with your supposed talent wouldn't mind demonstrating her abilities, unless, of course, you have something to hide. The class laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that made Jasmine's skin prickle with rage. This wasn't just about proving herself, it was about survival. Fine, Jasmine said, her tone firm and unyielding. Let's do it. Whitmore's eyes gleamed with malice. Excellent. Come to the front. Jasmine rose from her seat, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. The entire class stared at her, some openly sneering, others eyeing her with amusement. She walked to the front of the room, her head held high, refusing to show weakness. Whitmore handed her a chalk and gestured toward the board. I will give you a series of problems. You will solve them here in front of everyone. If you truly earned that top score, then this should be a breeze for you. His voice dripped with poison, but Jasmine could see the underlying desperation in his eyes. He wanted her to fail, needed her to fail. Let's begin, shall we? Whitmore announced, his words laced with sadistic glee. He scribbled a problem on the board, something monstrously complicated involving advanced calculus and abstract algebra. Jasmine's eyes scanned the equation, her mind clicking into action like the smooth turning of gears. She began writing, her movements precise and deliberate. The classroom fell into a tense silence, the sound of her chalk against the board, the only thing cutting through the oppressive air. Whitmore watched her every move, his expression turning darker as the seconds ticked by. Within minutes, Jasmine completed the problem and stepped aside, her jaw clenched as she stared defiantly at Whitmore. He didn't even glance at her work. Instead, he scrawled another problem across the board, even more convoluted than the last. Again, Jasmine felt the sharp sting of his disdain, but she didn't falter. Her fingers danced over the board, her mind blazing with the thrill of solving each challenge. Problem after problem, she tackled everything Whitmore threw her way. But he wouldn't stop. With each solution, he grew more desperate, his frustration bleeding through his thinning smile. "What's the matter, Professor?" Jasmine asked, her voice calm despite the pounding of her heart. "Running out of problems to give me?" The class shifted uncomfortably. Some students' eyes gleamed with something akin to admiration, others with resentment. But the truth was becoming undeniable. Whitmore's plan was crumbling, and he couldn't stand it. "Very well, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice thick with poorly disguised fury. "It appears you're capable of memorizing formulas. Congratulations." After all she had demonstrated, he still refused to acknowledge her abilities. It was no longer just about racism, it was about cruelty. Pure, unadulterated cruelty. "Memorizing?" Jasmine echoed, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You think I just memorized those problems? That's not how math works, Professor. You, of all people, should know that." "Watch your tone, Ms. Johnson," Whitmore snapped, his eyes blazing. "You may think you're clever, but you are not special, and you most certainly do not belong here." The words hit her like knives, slicing away the confidence she had built so carefully. The class remained silent, some of them shifting awkwardly, others grinning with satisfaction. But Jasmine refused to let his words break her. "Not this time." "I belong here as much as anyone else," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "You may not want to see it, but I'm not going anywhere." Whitmore's expression twisted into a look of pure hatred. "We'll see about that," he muttered. Jasmine returned to her seat, her hands shaking, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the rest of the lecture. She had stood up to him, but she knew this was far from over. If anything, she had just made herself an even bigger target. The air in the classroom was suffocating. Jasmine could feel the stares of her classmates burning into her back as she returned to her seat. But it wasn't over. She knew Whitmore wouldn't let it be over. His pride had been wounded. His attempt to humiliate her turned against him like a boomerang. He paced back and forth in front of the classroom, his eyes narrowed, his expression twisted in barely contained fury. For a moment, it seemed like he was fighting himself, trying to decide if he should let it go or strike harder. And then he made his choice. "Ms. Johnson," Whitmore's voice rang out, cold and sharp, "I'm afraid I've been too lenient with you. Given your sudden, remarkable performance, I've decided it's only fair to reevaluate your previous grades. After all, if you are this brilliant now, surely you must have been cheating before." Jasmine's eyes widened. "What?" "Yes, I will be reviewing all of your past assignments for plagiarism, shortcuts, or any indication of dishonesty, and I will make sure the university's academic board is informed of my findings." The words punched Jasmine in the gut. The accusation was clear, cruel, and calculated. It was more than an insult. It was a threat, one that could destroy everything she had worked for. "You can't do that," Jasmine said, her voice cracking but steady. "Oh, I assure you I can. And I will. No one gets special treatment in my class." "Certainly not you," Whitmore replied, his tone dripping with venom. Some students snickered. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that not everyone supported Whitmore's blatant attack, but no one dared speak against him. Not with the power he wielded over their grades. The cruelty wasn't just coming from Whitmore. Jasmine could feel the disdain from her peers, the ugly looks, the low whispers that rose like dark clouds around her. She probably bribed someone to get those answers. Come on, you know her kind. Always looking for the easy way out. Didn't even deserve to be here in the first place. The voices stabbed at her, but she held her head high. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here. Not in front of Whitmore. The worst part was knowing she couldn't report him. How could she? He was a respected professor, an established authority with years of experience. She was just a black girl from the South Side, struggling to make it in a place that wasn't built for people like her. Her scholarship was her lifeline. Without it, she couldn't afford the tuition. And Whitmore knew it. This was his way of breaking her, of ensuring she never forgot her place. But Jasmine wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. After class, she gathered her books, her hands trembling from the effort of keeping herself together. As she headed for the door, Whitmore's voice called out to her once more. "Ms. Johnson," he said with a smile so cold it chilled her bones. "I expect to see you in my office this afternoon. We need to discuss your academic integrity. And believe me, I will be thorough." The threat was clear. He was going to tear her apart, piece by piece. Jasmine nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. She pushed through the door and stumbled into the hallway, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Hey, Jasmine." The voice was soft, hesitant. She turned to see Marcus, a fellow student who had always been friendly, if a bit distant. "That was messed up," he said, his expression apologetic but wary, like he wasn't sure if he should be talking to her at all. "What Whitmore did back there, it wasn't right." "Tell him that," Jasmine replied, her voice tight. "But thanks for saying something." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. I know things haven't been fair for you. And what he said about reviewing your work? That's just him being petty. Everyone knows you're smart. Really smart." She looked at him, searching for any hint of mockery, but all she saw was sincerity. For a moment, her chest loosened, just a little. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because—" Marcus hesitated, then sighed. "Because I see what's happening, and it's messed up. And because I figured you might need to hear someone say it. You earned your spot here. No one can take that from you." Jasmine swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thanks, Marcus. Really." He nodded and walked away, his shoulders hunched as if carrying some invisible weight. Jasmine watched him go, wondering if she'd just seen the first glimpse of an ally. But she couldn't rely on sympathy. She couldn't afford to. Whitmore had declared war, and she needed to be ready for whatever he threw her way. With her fists clenched, she made her way to her dorm room, her mind already forming a plan. If Whitmore wanted to destroy her, he was going to have to fight a battle he was woefully unprepared for. Because Jasmine Johnson was done playing by his rules, Jasmine sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her phone lay beside her, the screen black and lifeless. She had tried calling her mother twice, but the words kept catching in her throat. How could she explain what was happening? How could she make her mother understand the cruelty she was facing every day? The email from Professor Whitmore had arrived an hour earlier. His words were sharp, dripping with disdain. "Ms. Johnson, upon reviewing your previous assignments, I have found several inconsistencies that suggest deliberate manipulation of results. As I suspected, you have been attempting to deceive me and the institution through dishonest means. I will be formally reporting you to the academic board. You will be lucky if you aren't expelled. Your attempts to take shortcuts in a program meant for genuine scholars will not be tolerated. Your little act in class today was nothing more than a desperate attempt to cover up your incompetence. I suggest you prepare yourself for the inevitable. Sincerely, Professor Arthur Whitmore." Her hands shook as she reread the email, the harshness of his words slicing into her. Jasmine's stomach twisted with nausea, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. How could he be so cruel? How could anyone harbor so much hatred? And the worst part was, she could feel the resentment from some of her classmates, too. She had overheard them whispering in the hallway, their words like poison dripping into her ears. Of course, Whitmore's after her. She's been faking it all along. She's just trying to use the race card to guilt her way through. It's not fair. People like her shouldn't even be here if they can't handle it. People like her? She had heard that phrase too many times. They said it with disgust, with judgment, as if her very existence was an offense. As if she was somehow undeserving of her place at the university, despite all the nights she had stayed up studying, her eyes burning from reading until dawn. The tears came unbidden, hot and angry, spilling down her cheeks like a river of frustration. She hated feeling this way. So small, so powerless. Whitmore's words weren't just insults. They were weapons meant to crush her spirit, to make her believe she was nothing. She glanced at her textbooks stacked neatly on her desk, pages marked with colorful tabs, notes scribbled in the margins, formulas she had memorized and understood. She had worked hard, harder than anyone knew. But none of it seemed to matter. To people like Whitmore, her intelligence was a mistake, an error he was determined to correct. The door swung open, and her roommate, Mia, walked in. Mia was a tall, freckle-faced girl with bright red hair and a cheerful personality that lit up every room she entered. But when she saw Jasmine's face, her smile faltered. "Jazz, what happened?" Mia asked, concern knitting her brows. "Nothing. Just Whitmore being Whitmore." Jasmine's voice was thick with bitterness. Mia sank onto the bed beside her. "That man's an absolute monster. What did he do this time?" "He's reporting me to the academic board. Says I've been cheating." Jasmine's voice cracked on the last word. "What?" Mia's eyes widened with fury. "That's insane. You've been working your butt off in that class. Everyone knows you're like the smartest person in there." "Not everyone," Jasmine said bitterly. "To some of them, I'm just a charity case, an outsider trying to steal what they think belongs to them." Mia's fists clenched. "I swear, if I hear one more person say some racist crap about you, I'll—" "Don't," Jasmine cut her off. "It won't change anything. They'll still think what they think, and Whitmore will still try to ruin me. Jazz, you can't let him do this. You have to fight back." "Fight back how?" Jasmine snapped, the frustration pouring out of her like a broken dam. "He's a respected professor. I'm just me. Who's going to believe me over him?" Mia's expression softened, her voice dropping to a gentle tone. "I believe you. And I'm sure there are others who will too. You just have to find them. And don't let him bully you into silence." Jasmine looked down at her hands, her nails digging into her palms. Her mind was a tangled mess of rage, sadness, and helplessness. She had spent her entire life fighting against the low expectations people placed on her because of her skin color. But this was something else. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to break her, to make her feel small and unworthy. And worst of all, it was working. But then, deep within her, something sparked. A tiny flame of defiance. Jasmine raised her head, her eyes fierce and determined. "You're right," she whispered. "I can't let him win." Mia's face broke into a relieved smile. "That's my girl. We'll figure this out. And if Whitmore thinks he can just get away with this, he's got another thing coming." Jasmine nodded, her voice steady. "I'm not giving up, no matter what." But even as she spoke, the fear lingered in her chest. Whitmore had power, and he wasn't afraid to use it. If she was going to survive this, she needed to be ready for the storm that was coming. And somehow, she had to make sure her voice was heard. The following morning, Jasmine walked into the classroom with her head held high. The hostile stares and whispered insults pricked at her like needles, but she refused to let them break her resolve. She had spent all night drafting a formal complaint, detailing every instance of Professor Whitmore's discrimination. But she knew her words alone wouldn't be enough. So, she began gathering evidence. She went through every assignment, every email, every grading sheet, documenting the discrepancies in how she was being treated compared to her white peers. The bias was undeniable, even if Whitmore thought his cruelty was perfectly veiled. Mia had rallied behind her, making sure she ate and took breaks while she worked. She even convinced a few other students to speak up about Whitmore's racist remarks. The small but determined group gathered in Jasmine's room, sharing their stories, their voices blending into a symphony of truth. "There's strength in numbers, Jas," Mia said, as they finished compiling their reports. "He can't silence all of us." Jasmine smiled, her eyes glassy with gratitude. She had spent so long feeling isolated, convinced that everyone else was against her. But now, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, she felt her strength growing. The next step was the scariest one. She had to bring her evidence to the dean's office, and if Whitmore was as powerful as everyone claimed, there was a real chance her complaint would be buried. But the fire within her refused to be smothered. The walk to the dean's office was nerve-wracking. Every step felt like a battle, her heartbeat loud and frantic in her ears. But when she finally entered the office, the secretary's kind smile and reassuring words helped calm her nerves. Jasmine presented her evidence to Dean Carter, a stern but fair woman known for her integrity. As she spoke, her voice steady and unwavering, the dean's expression shifted from polite attention to genuine concern. Jasmine laid everything bare, not holding back on the emotional toll Whitmore's treatment had taken on her. When she finished, the silence was thick, tense. Dean Carter folded her hands and leaned forward. "This is serious, Jasmine. Very serious. And if what you're saying is true, Professor Whitmore's behavior is unacceptable." "It is true," Jasmine said firmly. "I have proof, and others are willing to speak up too." The dean nodded. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll launch a full investigation immediately. And if Whitmore has abused his position, he will be held accountable." Jasmine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter, but she knew the fight was far from over. Whitmore wouldn't go down without a fight. But neither would she. The investigation began the very next day. Jasmine could feel the shift in the air, like the quiet rumble of a storm waiting to break. Professor Whitmore's demeanor had become more agitated, his eyes narrowing whenever he looked her way. It was as if he could sense the power she was reclaiming, and it enraged him. But Jasmine wasn't alone anymore. More students stepped forward, their statements stacking up like bricks in a wall of truth. Mia coordinated everything with a fiery passion, encouraging others to share their experiences and making sure their voices were heard. Jasmine found herself in the dean's office repeatedly, providing details, answering questions, and presenting evidence. Each meeting was exhausting but necessary. Dean Carter was thorough, and despite her stern exterior, Jasmine could see the sincerity in her efforts. This was no longer a matter of hearsay, it was a documented pattern of abuse. Whitmore, however, was not going down quietly. He stormed into the classroom one afternoon, his face flushed and his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "So," he sneered, his gaze locked on Jasmine like a hawk targeting its prey. "You think you can just spread lies and slander to undermine my reputation? You think your baseless accusations will change anything?" The room went dead silent. Jasmine swallowed hard but refused to cower. "They're not lies, Professor Whitmore, and you know that." Whitmore's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. "You arrogant little girl! You think you're special because you solved a few equations? Because you managed to make a spectacle of yourself in my class? You have no idea what you're dealing with." His words dripped with venom, each syllable designed to tear her down. Jasmine could feel her classmates' eyes on her, some watching with sympathy, others with judgment. "I'm dealing with the truth," Jasmine replied, her voice trembling but steady. "And the truth doesn't go away just because you try to intimidate me." His fists clenched at his sides. "You have no future here. No school will want you with this kind of reputation. You're nothing but a troublemaker. And people like you never get far. People like you." The phrase sent a chill through her spine, but it also stoked the fire inside her. Whitmore's hatred was so blatant, so raw, and she was done pretending it didn't exist. "People like me," Jasmine repeated, her eyes blazing. "You mean people who work hard despite all the hatred thrown their way? People who refuse to be silenced just because someone in power decides they don't belong? Well, guess what, Professor? I do belong here, and nothing you say will change that." Whitmore's lip curled in disgust. "You'll regret this, Jasmine. Mark my words." And with that, he stormed out of the room, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Jasmine sat down slowly, her hands trembling from the confrontation. Mia squeezed her shoulder, her grip solid and reassuring. "You did great, Jas," Mia whispered. "You didn't back down." "I'm tired of backing down," Jasmine admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "He thinks he can just keep walking all over me because I'm black, because I don't fit his idea of what a smart student should look like." "Well, you just showed him you're not going anywhere," Mia said firmly. "He messed with the wrong girl." The confrontation spread like wildfire. Other students were starting to talk, questioning why Whitmore was so intent on tearing Jasmine down. And some of the professors were paying attention too, their curiosity piqued by the ongoing investigation. But Jasmine couldn't relax. As much as she wanted to believe the worst was behind her, she knew Whitmore wouldn't give up that easily. He had already proven he was willing to destroy her reputation, and she had no doubt he was plotting his next move. Yet, despite the fear curling in her stomach, Jasmine's determination only grew stronger. She wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for every black student who had ever been told they weren't good enough. And this fight was far from over. Days passed, and the investigation continued. Jasmine's determination grew with each step, but so did her anxiety. She couldn't ignore the hateful glares from Whitmore's supporters, students who admired him and would do anything to defend him. "Troublemaker," someone muttered as she walked past the cafeteria. "Why can't she just leave?" another voice whispered, loud enough for her to hear. "Doesn't she know people like her should be grateful to even be here?" It stung, but Jasmine's resolve remained unshaken. She refused to be silenced, to be beaten down by ignorance and prejudice, and despite the harassment, she kept her head high. Professor Whitmore, however, was not one to go down without a fight. His efforts to undermine Jasmine's credibility grew more insidious. She began hearing rumors spread around campus that she was trying to ruin Whitmore's career for attention, that she was a bitter girl lashing out because she couldn't handle the pressure of real academia. The whispers chipped away at her confidence, but she didn't break. Not when she was so close to the truth being exposed. The real blow came when Jasmine received an email requesting her presence at a special meeting with the Dean's Council. The tone of the message was cold and formal, as though she were already on trial. Her hands shook as she read the email over and over again. Mia caught her staring blankly at the screen and gently took her laptop from her. "What's wrong, Jas?" Mia asked, concern written all over her face. "They want me to present my case in front of the Dean's Council," Jasmine whispered. "With Whitmore there. They're giving him a chance to defend himself." Mia's expression darkened. Of course they are. A respected white professor versus a black girl who dared to challenge him? They're gonna make it as difficult for you as possible. "With all due respect, Professor Whitmore," Jasmine began, her voice surprisingly steady, "this isn't about not being able to handle your class. It's about how you've consistently targeted me, insulted me, and tried to humiliate me because I'm black." A few council members shifted uncomfortably at her bluntness, but Jasmine didn't care. She laid out her case with precision, presenting the documented evidence of Whitmore's discriminatory behavior. She read out emails, grading inconsistencies, even statements from other students who had been brave enough to share their experiences. Whitmore's face grew redder with each word, but he remained silent, his eyes burning with fury. When she finished, Dean Carter leaned back, her gaze sharp and thoughtful. "Thank you, Miss Johnson. Professor Whitmore, would you care to respond?" Whitmore scoffed. "It's all nonsense. A desperate attempt from a student who couldn't handle criticism. If anything, her own incompetence is what's in question here, not my teaching methods." The room went silent, his blatant arrogance laid bare for everyone to see. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to them. Jasmine's heart raced as the silence grew heavier, pressing against her chest like a boulder. The council members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Dean Carter's face remained stoic, her fingers intertwined as she processed everything that had been laid before her. But Jasmine could see the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation. They were grappling with the same dilemma many institutions had wrestled with for generations, whether to uphold the truth or protect their own. Professor Whitmore's smugness only intensified the longer the silence stretched. He looked so sure of himself, so utterly convinced that he would walk away unscathed. His expression seemed to taunt her, to remind her that she was nothing more than a black girl daring to speak out against the establishment. Jasmine's stomach twisted. Maybe she hadn't done enough. Maybe this was all for nothing. Dean Carter cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. "We will deliberate and inform you of our decision soon. You may both leave." Jasmine's shoulders sagged as she rose from her chair. The urge to cry tugged at her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had been strong this far. She couldn't break now. Whitmore brushed past her, his smile laced with poisonous satisfaction. "Well, Jasmine, I hope you enjoyed your little performance. Unfortunately, your kind of defiance usually ends in disappointment." Jasmine gritted her teeth but refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. She hurried out of the room, her hands trembling as she called Mia. "Jazz, how did it go?" Mia's voice crackled through the phone, full of concern. I don't know. I told them everything, but—" Her voice wavered. "He's just so powerful, and they're all afraid of him." Mia's response was immediate and fierce. "You did the right thing, Jazz. They can't ignore the evidence. Not with all those testimonies and documents. And if they do, we'll take this higher. We're not giving up." The determination in Mia's voice rekindled Jasmine's hope, but doubt still lurked like a shadow. The following days were torturous. Jasmine dragged herself through her classes, her thoughts consumed by the looming verdict. Every look from her classmates felt like judgment, every whisper a reminder of her isolation. But then, one morning, her phone pinged. An email notification from the dean's office. With shaking fingers, Jasmine clicked on the message. The words blurred before her eyes, but as she read, her pulse quickened. Dear Miss Johnson, after careful consideration of the evidence provided and testimonies gathered, the Dean's Council has concluded that Professor Whitmore has engaged in discriminatory conduct unbecoming of his position as an educator. His actions were not only unethical, but harmful to the student experience and academic integrity of this institution. Effective immediately, Professor Whitmore's employment with this university has been terminated. Furthermore, a formal apology will be issued to you for the unjust treatment you endured. We sincerely apologize for the pain and hardship you have experienced, and thank you for your bravery in coming forward. Sincerely, Dean Evelyn Carter. Jasmine's hands flew to her mouth. He was gone. The man who had tried to destroy her was finally held accountable. Tears spilled from her eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. She read the email over and over again, her mind struggling to comprehend the words. It felt surreal, like she had been drowning for so long that she couldn't believe she was finally breathing again. She called Mia, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and joy. Mia, they fired him. Whitmore's gone. What? Mia's shriek nearly burst Jasmine's eardrum. Jazz, that's incredible. Oh my God, you did it. You freaking did it. Jasmine laughed, her tears mingling with her laughter. We did it, Mia. You were right there with me, every step of the way. Damn right I was, Mia replied with a proud sniff. And I'd do it all over again. That man had no business being a professor, let alone abusing his power the way he did. But it didn't end there. The news of Whitmore's firing spread like wildfire. Students whispered in astonishment, the truth of his actions exposing the cracks in the university's polished reputation. Other students of color began to come forward with their own stories of discrimination, emboldened by Jasmine's victory. Weeks later, the university held a public forum, addressing racism and academic integrity. Jasmine was invited to speak, her voice clear and strong as she recounted her experiences. She didn't hold back. She let them hear the pain, the frustration, and the determination that had carried her through. The university launched new policies to ensure students would never again be silenced by fear or prejudice. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And through it all, Jasmine continued to excel. She poured herself into her studies with renewed passion, her brilliance shining brighter than ever. One afternoon, as she walked out of the library, she spotted a group of black students laughing and talking in the courtyard. A younger girl caught Jasmine's eye and hurried over. "Hey, you're Jasmine, right?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with admiration. "The one who stood up to Professor Whitmore?" Jasmine nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "Yeah, that's me. I wanted to say thank you," the girl said shyly. "You made me feel like I belong here, like my voice matters." Tears prickled Jasmine's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "You do belong here, and don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." The girl beamed before hurrying back to her friends. Jasmine watched her go, her heart swelling with pride. She had faced the darkness, and she had won. And from that day on, Jasmine vowed to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that the truth would always find a way to rise above the hate. I hope you enjoyed the story. Feel free to share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.